I'm gonna tell you about what happens when you make your currency too strong. It's a story that starts with horses, ends with tanks, and takes us through World War II and the Cold War. When Germany invaded Poland in 1939, it was over before France and Britain could even declare war. Well, part of it was that Germany's plan for the war in Europe depended on speed. They needed to knock Poland out quickly because if they didn't, the rest of Europe would have time to react. And part of it was that Germany planned to invade the Soviet Union after Poland, but wanted to avoid having to fight two wars at once. Farmers abandoned their crops, city dwellers abandoned their homes, and entire cities sometimes even abandoned their walls. In fact, in 1218, while besieging a city called Kabul, Genghis Khan was approached by an ambassador asking for terms, but its legacy lived on in the Russian currency, the ruble, which eventually evolved into the modern Russian ruble. And in the 19th century, Russian rubles could be exchanged for German marks at the rate of 1-to-1. That was good for Russia. Well, remember how Genghis Khan counted the number of horses in every household, so he'd know how many soldiers he could raise. The problem was that most of the vehicles on the road were old. It rebuilt its economy and it rebuilt its transportation system, this time with a greater emphasis on trains and less on trucks. Suddenly there were millions of new households and millions of new vehicles, and it was impossible for the government to track them all, so it turned to technology. Germany developed a database that would keep track of the ownership of every vehicle registered in the country, and that way you couldn't just steal a registration and drive around pretending that you own it. Games like Grand Theft Auto had to start buying their own cars, but it also opened up the data to the public, specifically to anyone who needed to find out who owned a particular vehicle. In 2007, they passed a directive that allowed drivers to choose whether or not they wanted to equip their vehicles with electronic stability control. And in 2011, they set a deadline of November 2011 for manufacturers to introduce the feature on all new vehicles. We could have been using marks, but then they kept pushing back the deadline, and ultimately the feature didn't become mandatory until 2014. And the reason for this is pretty simple. Electronic stability control is actually more likely to cause a rollover than prevent one, which is a major issue for SUVs and crossovers, which are extremely popular in the United States. And given that the United States didn't require the feature, and neither did most of the EU, manufacturers didn't feel pressured to add it. And now it's managed by the KBA, the German Federal Motor Transport Authority. And the KBA doesn't just manage vehicle registrations in Germany, they're also responsible for making sure that German vehicles comply with European Union regulations. For instance, if someone hit your car and drove away, you could report it and use the database to find out who owned the car that hit you. And moving the responsibility of vehicle safety checks from the KBA to individual member states. This is, in part, a reaction to Volkswagen's emissions scandal in 2015. And it is possible that the KBA will eventually lose its power to regulate vehicle safety. You get better stuff, but that stuff isn't always compatible with other countries, and it's not a new problem either. Remember the German mark? Well, when it was revalued in 1916, it also boosted the German economy. German exports became dirt cheap and it stimulated domestic investment. But it also hurt the German auto industry. Suddenly, German cars were no longer competitive on international markets. And although that didn't have anything to do with Genghis Khan, the auto industry is still paying the price today. But it wasn't just for collisions. You could use the database to find out who owned any vehicle, and that could be useful if, say, you were planning a long road trip and you wanted to make sure that the car you rented wasn't going to break down in the middle of the trip. All of the vehicle codes had been removed, so nobody knew who owned what. But this left it with a weird problem. And when the rental company ran the vehicle's license plate in the national database, it came back with no results. That was weird. And it raised the question, if the system worked so well, why wouldn't John Doe's car show up? Well, it turned out that the person renting the car wasn't actually named John Doe. He was using a fake name to hide the fact that he'd stolen the car. Someone had broken into the National Vehicle Database. Was it a hacker? Was it a foreign government? Was it someone at the DMV? No, it was actually a 16-year-old kid playing a video game. The game was called Grand Theft Auto, and it was a virtual world where players could steal cars and drive them around. Except instead of buying a bunch of different cars, the player could just hack into the German vehicle database, steal a car from it and drive that car in the game. And it wasn't just Grand Theft Auto, other games did the same thing. And without knowing who owns the vehicle, you can't expect them to pay taxes on it. Well, the German government solved this problem in much the same way that Genghis Khan solved his. Every household was required to report the vehicles they owned, and that way the government could collect the proper taxes. They weren't designed to haul heavy loads, long distances, and by 1941, the German army was running low on fuel, so Hitler ordered that the government create a new nationalized transport system that would confiscate privately owned trucks and put them under state control. There was no easy way to figure out who owned what, but that created another problem. The solution was pretty genius, actually. A special organization would assign every vehicle a unique code that included the vehicle type, year, make, model, and color, as well as a sequential number. This code would then be stenciled on the vehicle itself, so that the army could immediately identify its owner. But the problem was, once the war was over, Germany was occupied, and the Allied forces assumed control of the transportation system. These vehicle codes were no longer useful, so they had to be removed. Over time, the process of nationalization and denazification took hold, and the Germans started to rebuild their lives. Eventually, the occupation ended and Germany was allowed to rejoin the international community. Well, it turns out that Germany would end up doing the exact same thing. As World War II began, the German government started tracking the number of vehicles in every household. And the reason they did this is pretty similar. If you've ever tried to mobilize a large group of people, you know that coordinating a lot of people is difficult. It's hard to get everyone on the same page, especially when the stakes are high. So instead of trying to manage a sprawling bureaucracy, the Germans just looked at the vehicles people had and took them. Germany had been registering motor vehicles since 1909. That's how they knew how many there were to take. After all, anyone who owned a car or a truck or a tractor probably owned a driver's license, too. So getting their vehicles meant that they'd be able to contribute to the war effort in some way. Having your currency pegged at the same value as another country tends to work best when both countries have similar economies, and in some cases, people could even opt to turn their vehicle over to the state in exchange for a slightly higher pension. Their military was growing rapidly and they wanted to look strong, but it wasn't so good for Germany. When Germany was spending heavily on its military, that made its economy look strong, but now it was giving Russia the impression that Germany's economy was also booming, which is why, when German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck noticed that the value of his mark was falling compared to the ruble, he decided to fix it. In 1871, he revalued the mark so that it matched the ruble. Not only did this stabilize the exchange rate, but it gave the German mark credibility on international markets. Oh yeah, Germany. After all, if the German mark was as valuable as the Russian ruble, it must be solid. The ambassador was confused why the city had even been able to resist the Mongols who were camped nearby, and without any effort to keep their currencies aligned, the German mark would have collapsed. But it didn't collapse, because in 1914, World War I broke out. And you know what happened to be one of the and Germany was no longer able to buy the silver needed to support the value of its currency. Now in theory, they could have fixed this by making the mark worth less silver, but instead they did the opposite. In 1916, they made the mark worth more silver. This meant that anyone who held the currency could trade it in for more silver than it was actually worth. So, at first, this seemed like a great deal, but it was actually a terrible idea because when Germany lost the war, the victorious powers demanded that Germany pay for the damages. And when you lose a war, you don't get to set the exchange rates. The result was that Germany had to devalue its currency anyway. And then in 1919, hyperinflation hit. The German government was printing money to pay off its debts, but it was producing so much that each mark was eventually only worth fractions of a penny. At the end of 1923, there were nearly 4.2 trillion marks in circulation. People needed to carry around wheelbarrows of cash for basic goods and services, and a German millionaire might only have the equivalent of $2,000 in today's money. And Khan's response perfectly illustrates the Mongol military mobilization advantage. If your people have the means to build these walls, he said, gesturing to the city behind them, why do you not build them 10 more cubits high that we cannot scale them? But since you have built them only just low enough to shelter you from our arrows, what use are they? Or 10 more cubits thick that we cannot batter them down? But since you have dug them only just wide enough to stop the passage of our horses, what use are they? Or 10 more cubits deep that we cannot dig under them? Then, indeed, you would have something to boast of. But since you have built them only just high enough to prevent our cavalry from reaching you, what use are they? He then went on to say, if your people can construct such catapults, why do they not build them 10 more cubits high that our catapults cannot reach, or 10 more cubits thick that our returning arrows cannot pierce? Then, indeed, you would have something to boast of. And finally, if your people can dig such deep pits, why do they not dig them 10 more cubits deep that our horses may fall into them? Then indeed you would have something to boast of. So knocking Poland out quickly meant that they could focus their military resources on the Soviets without distraction. It was full of silver and gold, and initially worth about 400 grams of silver. The minute became the go-to currency for merchants traveling along the Silk Road. It was easier to carry than sacks of coins or heavy bars of metal. And soon, other empires adopted the idea of paper money. And part of it was just classic textbook strategy, being ready and prepared and knowing how your enemy thinks. Hitler had planned it that way. The idea was to let Poland believe that it had time to mobilize its defenses, but in reality, he'd already started his invasion before those declarations of war would have gotten there. That strategy worked. You see, when Genghis Khan united the nomadic tribes of Mongolia in the 1200s, he created a massive horse-based empire stretching from the Pacific Ocean to Eastern Europe. The secret to this success was that he introduced accounting rules requiring every household to report the number of horses they owned. This was so that the empire could keep track of the number of soldiers that they had. See, back then, soldiers were typically expected to bring their own horses to war, so knowing how many horses there were in the empire told you how big the army was. But why? What made him think that it would? But another part of it, surprisingly, was a sort of byproduct of Mongolian history. And this system worked well for the Mongols, because, unlike most armies at the time, which kept their horses stabled between battles and fed mostly on grain, the Mongols kept their horses on the move. They herded them, along with their sheep and cattle, and used them to both ride and pull their carts. During the war, Germany stopped allowing people to buy new vehicles, but it never banned private ownership. They lived on the backs of these horses, so they traveled fast and far and with little need for supplies. And that meant that the Mongol Empire could raise a huge army very quickly. When word got around that Genghis Khan's army was coming, everyone knew that they were in trouble. Genghis Khan's military successes led to the creation of a new metal coin, one that would become known as the manta, which comes from the Turkish word for full. In fact, the moneda stayed relevant until the 1920s when the Soviet Union replaced it with the Mongolian tugrik, except it wasn't. Germany's industrial and economic growth was nowhere near Russia's. Now, you might be wondering, does any of this have anything to do with Mongolia? But here's where things get strange. By this point, it was the 1950s, and Germany was eager to show the world that it had changed. This system worked well until 1990, when the German reunification brought 17 million new people into the country. But then in 2009, someone named John Doe wanted to rent a car. So in 2010, Germany changed the law. Instead of listing the owner of the vehicle, the database now listed the owner of the registration. Today, the German vehicle registry is still in use, but it has expanded beyond cars. It includes motorcycles, trailers, caravans, and even boats. But it's not all sunshine and rainbows. The EU is considering creating a single European vehicle type approval system. However, it is worth noting that the EU hasn't exactly been consistent on this issue. In fact, the whole situation highlights one of the main drawbacks of having a strong currency. So maybe next time you hear someone complaining about how strong the dollar is, just remember that it could have been worse.